Good morning, everyone. My name is Caroline Eister. I'm Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property, Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And today we have with us presenters and co-authors of the recently released a report examining the accuracy, uniformity, and equity of Philadelphia's 2023 real estate assessments. Title of today's presentation is Assessment Equity, looking at evidence of systemic racial and ethnic bias in Philadelphia real estate tax assessments. And I'd like to introduce our presenters, Ira Goldstein of the Reinvestment Fund, Arthur Lyons, Center for Economic Policy Analysis, or CEPA, Chicago, and Montgomery Wilson, Community Legal Services Incorporated. America has become increasingly aware of the historical legacy of systemic racial and ethnic discrimination in areas ranging from public school funding and education to the criminal justice system. Many cities and municipalities nationwide are starting to investigate the issue of systemic racial and ethnic bias in property tax assessments and valuations, a bias which may affect the accuracy and amount of every homeowner's property tax bill. With that, I'd like to have our presenters get started, but I would also, just a few housekeeping issues. If you have questions, we ask that you either hold them till the end of the presentation or place them in the chat and we'll address them as they come up. If there's opportunity for interaction, you can use your chat or your reaction buttons, and I will turn it over to our presenters. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Monty Wilson. I'm with Community Legal Services. We are going to jump slightly off plan right off the bat because I'm going to introduce myself, and then I have a couple of questions I would like to ask the audience. And if you could take your mics off, I'd just like a few of you to popcorn your answers. We started doing this work in 2000, because property tax assessments were going up dramatically in Philadelphia. And before we jump into kind of what we found and how we got there, which I think the how question is the really interesting part, I wanted to start just by asking the audience, if you want to turn your mic on for a minute, and just my two questions are: how many of you have dealt with systemic bias, whether it's racial, whether it's economic, whether it's ethnic, in your professional lives or your personal? And also, what were you hoping to get out of today's presentation? Does anyone want to respond? If you want to raise your hand, we're happy to hear from you.
Is it possible that this is set up so people?
Oh, it looks like we just got, I'm posting in the chat, the mics are muted.
Yeah,
okay.
That's what I was just wondering.
That's okay. If you want to post your responses in the chat, we can jump on them later and take a look at them. I suspect that everyone here has had some professional and personal experience with systemic bias. The classic examples right now in Philadelphia are, well, anywhere in the nation, are the criminal justice system. That's what really got all this rolling in 2020, looking at bias in police procedures, looking at bias in the court systems. The other one that I've been dealing with for 20 years is systemic bias in lending. When I started in Philadelphia, I was a predatory lending foreclosure defense attorney, and looking at racial bias in mortgage lending has been a huge issue for decades. It's one of Ira's specialties. And he and I have been working on that issue together for over 20 years at this point. What I want to do now is just jump to the agenda for today. Ira's going to be controlling the PowerPoint, so if we could pull that up. Okay. All right, if you could jump ahead, I think it's slide 3. So today's agenda, we're going to try to do this in 60 minutes, and I think we'll get there. We've taken care of introductions. I've got the job of kind of laying out the bare bones of this, the unsexy part. Wait till we get to the graphs and charts, which is, I think, where the really interesting meat of all this is. But I want to give you a little of the background of how we got here, and then talk about the framework for what we did. Because obviously my agenda is that I want every municipality in the state of Pennsylvania to be thinking about looking at assessment equity. And we really did work hard to come up with the right framework. You'll see there were kind of 2 iterations of that, and figure out what the right measurements were for this. And what we ended up doing was a ratio study plus demographics, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then a brief review of the actual first study that we did, which came out in 2021, and then the second equity study, which is the one we're going to talk most about today, and that's the 70-page document that I'm betting most of you have seen. We'll take a minute to talk about our findings, and then our recommendations for how we think this could be improved, and a brief update about how Philadelphia has started to tackle this problem. And then I think we'll have some time for questions. We'll also have some natural stopping points during the presentation where I think we can pause for a minute and take some questions. So with that in mind, let's just jump right into the background. So I'm actually the person who started this problem, at least in Philadelphia. For years, we had homeowners coming into Philadelphia complaining about their property tax assessments, and that wasn't something that we focused on. As I said, I was a mortgage foreclosure defense attorney. Then in about 2005, we started seeing more and more people coming in dealing with tax foreclosures, and that increased dramatically in 2014 or so. We fought for a long time to get people lots of due process rights, the ability to get into kind of a reasonable income-based payment plan, but we weren't looking at assessments. But during all that time, people would come to us regularly and say, I don't think these assessments by the Office of Property Assessment are accurate. I don't think they took the interior condition of my house into account. I don't think it's the same as my neighbors. A lot of my clients were quite savvy about looking up their neighbors' assessments and seeing that their assessment was $300,000, but the same row house two doors down in a block in North Philadelphia, same square footage, 3-story row house, my neighbor's assessment was $100,000. How can that be? And a lot of their questions were, is this focused in minority neighborhoods? Is this, an attempt to push us out of the way in the Broad Street corridor for development? But one of the biggest problems was this was all anecdotal. And the other problem was a lot of our clients weren't necessarily dealing with inaccuracies. They were dealing with gentrification. So they would come in complaining of a skyrocketing assessment, but the issue wasn't the inaccuracy. The issue was your property value has skyrocketed, and in fact, you might be being underassessed. But the whole time I had this nagging feeling that there was something there. I just couldn't prove it. And if we jump to the next slide, just before the pandemic, I was down in Philadelphia City Hall, and I ran into Ira on a completely different issue, and I was telling him exactly what I just said. And he looked at me after about 30 seconds and said, Monty, I can prove it. And I think he thought he could prove it in about 3 to 6 months. And he kind of did. We got a small amount of funding during the pandemic to do an assessment equity study. That was the first one. We came out with that in 2001. And I think the least interesting thing about today is our results. The first study showed that, yes, if you drilled down into the neighborhoods, there was evidence of a systemic racial and ethnic and income-based bias in residential assessments in Philadelphia. That's also what the second study concluded. I think what's really interesting about that is how we reached that conclusion and how that I think, even improved our methodology from the first report to the second report. So we took that first report directly to the Office of Property Assessment, met with their Chief of Staff, A.J. Eros, and after some initial resistance, I'll give him credit, he agreed to meet with us and walked us through a series of trainings. We met about 10 times over the course of a year to learn all about the details of their program, because their 2 objections really were, one, we had used the publicly available data for our ratio study, and they felt that that data was not sufficiently vetted, not sufficiently accurate, and that we needed to have used what came to be known as the OPA sales file to get a more accurate picture. And that secondly, we had used data obviously from 2019 backwards, because this was pre-pandemic, and that they had made really significant changes and improvements in their procedures. And so that while that data might say one thing, it didn't reflect the improvements they'd made. And, I don't know if I entirely agree with the OPA's objections, but in a real effort of good faith, we decided to give them the benefit of the doubt, and IRA, God bless, and found a second source of funding for us to do an entirely new assessment study, but this time with a twist added, that we would take two different sets of data, the OPA sales file, what they felt was the correct data, and our own reinvestment fund data file, which was really this data file that Ira and his assistants Colleen and others at the reinvestment fund worked up so that we had kind of our own independent source and say, we're going to run the same analysis on both and see what we get. And again, what came out of it was there absolutely are hotspots in Philadelphia where assessments are going up. All of this was perfectly timed because new valuations came out in 2023. And again, I had clients coming to us who saw 31% increases, and we had plenty of clients who saw much more. I have one woman who had her assessment go from $90,000 just before the pandemic, then that was frozen during the pandemic, and her first new assessment in 3 years increased her valuation to $513,000. You can imagine her questions were, I don't think the OPA has accurately assessed my home. I think they didn't take into account my flooding basement. They didn't take into account the condition of the property, my roof. And also, I have to wonder, is this happening to me because I'm African American? And I checked my neighbor's assessments and they did not go up by 500%. So she was quite angry. With that in mind, we did the second study, and that led to where we are today. And you'll see when Art and Ira get to the really interesting stuff here, what that really showed. But what I want to take a minute to go through is what we did, the framework built around it. So if you could jump to the next slide. Just a second on what is systemic bias. I think these days, a lot of people have pretty clear idea of what people are talking about when that comes up. We're not looking at evidence of intentional discrimination, but rather the procedures and practices that institutions operate in, which might advantage certain social groups and disfavor others. Again, the classic one, public school funding. If you live in an area with low property values and don't have as much money for the schools, and you have a larger population like Philadelphia, per capita, students are going to receive less funding and less education value for their dollar. The criminal justice system being another one. With that framework in mind, we had to ask ourselves, how do we measure systemic bias? If we jump to the next slide, it really split in two. There were two sets of measurements. What we did really, some of you may know this, some of you won't, in the assessment business, the standard measure of quality is known as a ratio study. And there is a national organization, the International Association of Assessing Officers, that sets the national standards for what is a quality assessment. They have several measures, but their kind of top three measures of quality assessments are the median ratio, the coefficient of dispersion, and the price-related differential. And what we did was simply take those three measures and do a ratio study on residential property assessments in Philadelphia. The median ratio is kind of the one you would all expect it to be. If my home is valued at $100,000, picture a single row home in Philadelphia, then if that's the fair market value of it, if that's what I bought it for this year, it should be assessed by the taxing bureau at $100,000. The IAO allows a little variation off that. A assessment might be considered accurate if it comes in at $90,000 or if it comes in a little over at $110,000, but you're looking to have a one-to-one relationship. And in fact, in Philadelphia, by law, the pre-established ratio is 1-to-1. Other counties have different ratios. The second test is the coefficient of dispersion. That's a little different. Now you have to picture $100,000 or $100,000 of those $100,000 row homes clustered together in North Philadelphia, maybe in a couple blocks. If the average value is supposed to be $100,000, what's the level of variation from that? The way I like to put it is neither God nor the law nor the IAO expects perfection when these measurements are made. There's no way the assessing entity could do that. They can't possibly individually inspect every property. So what from this $100,000 average, what's the acceptable degree of variation? And that's the coefficient of dispersion. In Philadelphia, it's about 15%. So that means a property on average might vary from $85,000 and still be within an acceptable COD to $115,000 and still be within. And it doesn't matter whether it's high or low. It's just measuring the amount of variation in a particular area. The problem is if you get outside of that range, that 15% in Philadelphia, then you're considered inaccurate and non-uniform. And finally, there's the price-related differential. And that compares higher value properties and lower value properties, the regressivity of the assessments. So here, what you're really asking is, if I look at those $100,000 properties in Philadelphia and I see that the COD is reasonably accurate or the median is reasonably accurate, are they getting the same degree of accuracy compared to higher value properties in Philadelphia? It'd be a neighborhood like Chestnut Hill, where you might have a $500,000 property. The numbers are going to be different, but is the measures of quality going to be roughly the same between lower income neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods? And I don't think it'll surprise you that what we discovered was that the median ratios, the coefficient of dispersion, and the price related differential all tend to be accurate in white, higher income neighborhoods in Philadelphia, but you have more problems and properties are generally more likely to be inaccurately assessed or overassessed in lower income neighborhoods. So with those three measures, what do you do with that? What we did that was unique was we brought in demographic data based on race. So if we can jump to the next slide. What we really did was just take racial data, knowing the most African-American, the majority African-American neighborhoods in Philadelphia, the majority Hispanic neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and the lowest income neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and mapped those onto our three measures of assessment quality. It really boiled down to two questions. If you have measures of accuracy, even if they're inaccurate, even if uniformity isn't what it should be, even if accuracy isn't what it should be, even if things are regressive, are the mistakes spread evenly across the city so there's no bias? Or are those mistakes clustered in certain neighborhoods? And I don't think it will surprise anybody that what we found was when you drill down, you find that things are more likely to be inaccurate, non-uniform, and regressive in low-income Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So that was our framework. And to walk through the first report, Ira's going to show you the really interesting stuff.
Thank you, Monty, and good morning, everybody. My name is Ira, and pleasure to speak with you all today. The first of the studies that Monty mentioned really sort of dug into the data in a way that I think in some ways hasn't been done in quite some time in Philadelphia. The graphics that you're looking at here are ways of, I think, trying to express in graphic form what Monty described of those measures. So if I could draw your attention to the graphic on the lower left-hand corner, think about that red dashed line, red dashed curve that looks sort of like a normal curve, is suggesting that it would be appropriate for the typical value in the city of Philadelphia. In fact, it's legally supposed to be the case that the typical value in Philadelphia should be that a property is assessed at should be equal to its actual value. And that was really how Philadelphia came to that actual value initiative, or AVI. That red curve focuses right on that one, which would be $100,000 properties at $100,000, a $500,000 properties at $500,000, et cetera. And as Monty mentioned, nobody expects perfection. We know that for a variety of reasons, there will be, let's call them errors, but there will be errors or differences in the way properties are assessed. But the expectation is those errors are more or less random, and that they distribute themselves normally in this bell-shaped curve kind of way around one. What we observed, though, was that Philadelphia's looked like this black curve, and that is, in essence, that peak, that typical value was substantially below one. In fact, as I recall, it was about 85, 86, 87%. So a $100,000 property was typically assessed at $87,000. And in fact, it really wasn't typically it wasn't perfectly normally distributed. And in fact, you have that long tail going out to those higher ratios. If I draw your attention to the graphic on the right side, think about that as along the horizontal dimension, you are referencing the sale price of a property, and on the vertical axis, you're referencing the OPA's assessed value of a property. The way it's supposed to be, each of those little black dots representing a sale with its accompanying assessed value should be really sort of distributed right around, plus or minus on that red dashed line. That is that 1-for-1 ratio. That is what we're supposed to have by law, actually. And in fact, what you find is you don't find a nice, pretty normal distribution of points reasonably close to that red dashed line and, an equal number above and below. But what you observe here is something more akin to what we see described in that blue line, which is the typical line through. And therein, what we're saying is essentially, if you look at those lower priced properties, those properties that are on the lower left-hand side of this graphic, many more of them are above the line, meaning they're overassessed. And if you look to the right-hand side of this graph, you see a bunch more that are below the line, some very much below the line. So in essence, you weren't seeing that 1-for-1 ratio that you would expect of sale price and assessed value. And in fact, you see this sense of what Monty described as regressivity, such that, take two people, the $100,000 person, well, their property might be assessed at $100,000, but the $1 million property might be assessed at $800,000. So as you work your way up this property value dimension, what you find is the assessments are a little bit lower as you go up. And in essence, that's what we mean by regressivity. Those who have more valuable property are assessed at a higher ratio than those who have lower valued properties.
Assessed at a lower ratio.
Pardon me?
Those with the higher values are assessed at a lower ratio.
Lower ratio, yes. So if we look at what we're observing on this table right here, what we're trying to do is express several things simultaneously. Firstly, we're breaking up the city by the zone within which assessments are made, or the OPA zone. Those are just labeled with letters A through whatever, Q, P, whatever it is. But we also will show in the next two columns of the table, the percent Black and the percent Hispanic, and then in the next column, the household income. What we're then doing in the remaining columns that are colored red and green is we're expressing to you the measures of assessment quality, both the typical ratio, the coefficient of dispersion or uniformity, and the price-related differential or regressivity. Green is good. Red is a problem. These OPA zones are ordered by the percent Black, and also sort of generally, although not exclusively, also ordered by income, etc. And what you observe is the top of the table, where the percent Black is highest, has way more red than the bottom of the table, where the percent Black is lowest. There are a couple exceptions to this. And for example, if you were to look at OPA zone G, which is sort of right in the middle of the table, you'll say, well, why is that dark red all the way across? Well, because the percent Black is relatively low vis-a-vis the rest of the city of Philadelphia. It's because the percent Hispanic is actually quite high. So one of the things that we observe is these measures of assessment quality tend to be less good in neighborhoods of color and low-income neighborhoods. And they're not only less good, but they're more disadvantageous to the people who reside in neighborhoods where there are predominantly populations of people of color, Black, Hispanic, and lower income. This is just a mapping of Philadelphia by those OPA zones, and later we'll show you some more detailed material. But on these maps, the darkest colors are more problematic, the lightest colors are better in terms of those assessment qualities. And what you'll see is in both of those measures, for example, for those of you familiar with Philadelphia, that OPA zone that's labeled H and G, those are areas, quite frankly, that are high in percent Black and high in percent Hispanic. Same with OPA zone B, which is in that Southwest Philadelphia area. And so, and even M will have parts that are high in percent Black and lower income, and parts that are relatively low. So the sort of the overall for that OPA zone doesn't seem quite as extreme. But what we're expressing in these maps is that those OPA zones with the higher percentages Black, the higher percentages Hispanic, tend to have the less good measures of assessment quality and the more disadvantageous measures. We had to come up with a theory as to why that is, and I think this is about my last slide. What we're showing here is a map that's doing a lot of different things simultaneously. We tried to understand why it was that these measures were coming out the way they were coming out. And one of the technical aspects of what OPA does in terms of both making the assessments and then examining themselves is deciding which sales should be used for purposes of making these assessments and which should not. There are lots of different legitimate reasons to include or exclude things. For example, a property, if Monty was my son and I wanted to sell Monty my home and I sold it to him for $5,000 because he's a good kid and I wanted him to have my lovely home for his family, well, then you wouldn't use that for assessment purposes at that $5,000 level because that price really wasn't a real market price. So what the IAAO suggests is a variety of different categories of sales that you could exclude for purposes of both creating the assessments and the ratio studies. But we observed that it wasn't just kind of randomly distributed across the city. So if you look at the map that's in front of you now, sort of forget about the blue lines and the hatch marks for a second. But if you think about the shading of the different areas in those colors from a cream color to a darker brown, what that's expressing is the percentage of sales that were excluded for purposes of creating these assessments. And where it's darkest, you're seeing upwards of 2/3, 3/4 of the sales were excluded. Well, now, if you allow your mind to sort of take in the blue line, that expresses where the percentage Black within those boundaries, where the percentage Black is over 50%, and the purple hatching is where the percent Hispanic is over 25%. One of the things you'll notice is that virtually all of the places where you have high percentages of rejected sales for purposes of creating these assessments fall within the city's Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And we think that that over rejection or the disproportionate rejection is what led to some of the problems that we observed. And that in some measure is also why we wanted to, in our second study, which Art's going to describe to you in a moment, we wanted to have two different data sets essentially to come up with the assessments. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to my colleague, Art.
Okay, thanks, Ira. So I'm Art Lyons. I'm with the Center for Economic Policy Analysis in Chicago. So we ended with this question about the data and the editing of the data. The second study, we decided to include a component specifically focused on the data selection process. The first set of sales that we used was created by OPA. We were talking with OPA, as Monty said, and they gave us what they judged was the best and appropriate set of sales to evaluate their work by. We accepted that and we used that set of sales as provided to us. And that's the first chart on the top right of this slide. It's the same scatter plot structure as Ira described for the previous research. The horizontal axis is the price actually paid for the property. The vertical axis is the assessment. The dashed red line is where the market values and assessments align. It's where all the assessments should be. It's where all the dots should fall along the line or very close to it. Any property below the line is underassessed. Any property above the line is overassessed. And the solid blue line is the computer's best effort to match the assessments with the sale prices. And it still shows that there's a tendency for higher priced properties actually to be underassessed, for lower priced properties to be overassessed. So that's the first data set we used in our evaluation. The second set is a set of sales that we developed independently from public records, the same data that anyone desiring to do research could obtain freely from the Recorder of Deeds. In addition to editing out transactions that we thought might not represent bona fide arm's length sales, we also eliminated the 5% of assessment ratios that were most extreme on the high side, and also the 5% that were the most extreme on the low side. We trimmed them out because, giving the benefit of the doubt to OPA, these transactions, may have been incorrectly reported sale prices rather than extremely inaccurate assessments for correctly reported sale prices. We wanted to give some benefit of the doubt to OPA. That's the scatter plot on the bottom of this slide, and we call this the reinvestment fund, or the RF sales file. And the smooth edges are because we trimmed out the most extreme cases. So that's a visual introduction to the two different data sets. If we look at the next slide, we see the same two charts as before, but this time with some statistics added in the text on the left. Both sets of sales show essentially accurate median assessments for small residential properties, either 0.99 or 1.01, where the target is 1.00. But the variation around that median is still larger than we would like to see. The RF sales show a coefficient of dispersion approaching 21%. Even the OPA sales show an average error just barely below IAAO's 15% maximum. The statistic known as the price-related differential is also troubling. The PRD based on OPA sales is 1.04. That's just above IAAO's limit of 1.03, but it's above nevertheless. And with RF sales, the PRD is quite a bit higher at 1.09. Compared to 2019, these citywide statistics are all significant improvements, but they still allow room for further improvement, especially with respect to eliminating the underassessment of high-value properties and reducing the average error in assessments for similarly valued properties, reducing the COD and bringing the PRD back into range where it should be. So now, this is the citywide picture. Let's look at different parts of the city on the next slide. And here we see the city broken into the 16 current OPA zones. OPA redesigns their zones with every reassessment, as they should, because the zones are designed, are supposed to incorporate reasonably homogeneous market areas. These are the current 16 OPA zones. In the chart on the left, the shaded area down the middle represents IAAO's acceptable range for the median assessment ratio. That is between 0.9 and 1.1, or 90% to 110% for the assessment ratio. Each row is one of the assessment zones. The black dot is the median assessment ratio computed from OPA sales, and the blue dot is the median ratio from RF sales. In a zone with only one dot, both sets of sales yield the same result. So now, reading up from the bottom of the chart, the median ratio for most zones is pretty close to where it should be, regardless of which data set we use. But there are a few zones that raise questions, even with the OPA sales file. These zones at the top of the chart are at the low end of the target range, or even actually underassessed, according to OPA, but they are at the high end of the target range for the median assessment ratio, and they're even overassessed, according to RF. So clearly, here we have a question about what's the proper data. The data sets here are at odds with each other. But either way, something is seriously wrong. And remember that it's just as bad from the community's point of view when somebody is underassessed as when they are overassessed. That's the general statistical picture. The maps on the right locate these problems geographically in the city of Philadelphia. The upper map is based on OPA sales. The red shaded zones are the ones with assessment ratios below the IAAO standard of 90%. The lower map is based on RF sales. Here, the darker colors indicate an assessment ratio above the IAAO standard of 1.1. Each map has the same problem zones. Clearly, something very unusual is going on with these assessments. What can we learn from the next couple of slides? So Ira, if you run the next slide. Here we're looking at the variation in assessments around the median in each zone. This is the coefficient of dispersion. The two darkest shaded areas on each map are zones with coefficients of dispersion above 15%, with the very darkest shades indicating an average dispersion of more than 30% above or below the median. So a $100,000 home, or each $100,000 of market value, would be assessed somewhere between 70,000 and 130,000, a spread of 60 percentage points. Let's go back to the previous slide. I apologize that we didn't get the maps lined up exactly right on these slides. They jump a little bit from left to right as we go from slide to slide, but I think you'll get the hang of it. So now I'm going to ask you to focus your eyes on the zones in these maps that are shaded the darkest. That is, the zones with the biggest problems in terms of the median assessment ratio. Now go to the next slide. And back to the previous. And the next again. The same areas with the most problematic median assessment ratios also have the largest coefficients of dispersion. And in addition, many more zones suffer from large coefficients of dispersion than from out-of-range median assessment ratios. In other words, although the median property owner in many zones is properly assessed, most of their neighbors are not. And when they are not properly assessed, they are off by quite a bit. Now let's go to the next slide. Here we've got the price-related differential. The two darkest shadings on each map indicate the zones with the most significant overassessment of low-value properties compared to higher-value properties in the same zone. The darkest shadings indicate what we're calling price regressivity. Lower valued properties have higher assessment ratios than higher valued properties. Can we go back to the previous? So again, look at the darkest shadings, and I'll go back to the previous slide and the previous. And now to the next. And the next. And back. And back. And forward. And forward. You can clearly see a lot of overlap in where the problems are. It's not perfect, but there's a lot of overlap in where the problems are. If we put all these statistics and maps together, the picture we get is this. The median assessment ratio in most parts of the city is pretty good, but in many zones, the average dispersion around that median is inappropriately large. And where those dispersions are the largest, it's the lower valued properties that have most of the variation on the overassessment side, while it's the higher valued properties in that zone that have dispersions on the underassessment side. Now, Ira, you want to carry us forward on this, please?
Thank you, Art. And I'll be very quick now. One of the things that we wanted to explore was not only whether or not OPA the Office of Property Assessments did a good job in terms of assessing or a not so good job with these sort of general measures of assessment quality, the ratio, the coefficient of dispersion, and the price-related differential. But whether or not, when they were out of tolerance, whether or not there was any relationship between that out of tolerance and, frankly, the degree to which that out of tolerance disadvantaged one group more than another, we wanted to explore that with respect to the demographic and economic characteristics of the neighborhoods within which properties are located. So this particular chart takes all of the census tracts in the city of Philadelphia and organizes them into 10 equally sized categories based on the percentage Black in those census tracts. So in that decile 10, we're looking at census tracts that are over 90% and frankly up to almost 99% Black. If we look at the bottom of that table with race decile number 1, those are places that are under 2% Black. Now, we're doing something similar as to before with the table that I showed you, which is to color the cells in the table to draw your attention to where there are out of tolerance ranges of these various measures of assessment quality. And as Art mentioned, the city is doing a pretty good job getting at that assessment ratio being within its tolerances. The one exception is the neighborhoods in Philadelphia where we're on race decile 9 using our sales file as opposed to the OPA sales file. And we show them as a good bit over 1. And those are neighborhoods that are between 83 and 90% Black. If we go to the coefficient of dispersion, those two columns differentiated again by the OPA reinvestment fund sales and the OPA sales, what you'll see is that the red is clustered, although not exclusively, but the red tends to be more clustered. and the values more severe, higher, in those deciles that are towards the top of the table. In other words, the city's blackest neighborhoods. And the same thing with the price-related differential. While they're pretty much out of range for all census tract categories in Philadelphia using our sales, and pretty much using OPA sales in most of the areas, you'll notice that the actual values are more severe for that regressivity in those black neighborhoods. For example, you're seeing 1.12, 1.13 for the PRD measures, which is well out of range and reflective of regressivity in those highest percent black neighborhoods. And while out of range in deciles 1 and 2, like under 5%, those values are lower. So they're all out of range using our sales data, but they're more severely out of range and out of range in a way that disadvantages people who live in the city's neighborhoods that are predominantly black. And this is a way of seeing it visually across the city. We're doing something a little bit differently now than the last map that I showed you, but draw your attention to the shadings of aqua, let's say, on the map. We are mapping here the coefficient of dispersion. Anything in those deeper aqua colors are where you're not only outside of range, but well outside of range. And then allow your eye to see the gold outline and the cross-hatching. Inside the gold outline, you're seeing neighborhoods that are in the top couple deciles of percent black, and where you're seeing the cross-hatching, the top couple deciles of percent Hispanic. And virtually every one of those census tracts that is in that dark aqua is found within the city's black and Hispanic neighborhoods, virtually every single one of them. We do the same thing in this next map with the price-related differential. You'll see a little bit less aqua and on the map, but it's generally the same picture. Pretty much anywhere where you see deep aqua on this map, it's within the city's black neighborhoods or within the city's Hispanic neighborhoods. And so it's not only that the assessment quality is less than perfect, but it's more less than perfect, and it's more less than perfect in a disadvantageous way inside of the city's black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And I will stop now and turn it to Art.
I'm going to jump in just for 1 second. If you could go back to that map. You were mentioning it's more disadvantageous in Hispanic neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. And I just wanted to summarize something that I think was implicit in all the slides we were just looking at. And it doesn't matter which data set you rely on, whether you use the OPA sales file or our reinvestment fund sales file. The 3 measures of assessment quality were more problematic in black and Hispanic neighborhoods.
Okay. There's this question of property tax abatements, where development areas receive reduced assessments as sort of incentives to promote redevelopment. They are, because they're receiving reduced assessments, that may drive up the sale price of the property through the capitalization process when buyers look at their costs of holding property. If the costs are going to be less, they're going to pay more for it. So it's not appropriate to use those sales in for assessment purposes. We found over 1,000 sales of properties with active abatements in OPA's sales file that they used for modeling. We still think to believe that even though they include those sales, which we don't think they should include, that they are excluding too many other sales in areas that they should not exclude. And this can very easily lead to incorrect model results. We know from talking with OPA that some of their criteria for rejecting sales are subjective. Any scientific process is at its core subjective, beginning with what question you ask in the first place. But nevertheless, the questions as whether it's a sale to a predatory speculator. How do you define a predatory speculator, and how do you recognize that from the data that are available in the public records? Cash sales. They tend to reject all cash sales, but not all cash sales are, in fact, non-representative of actual sale price. And then they have a category that they call sale price not reflective of market value. That's what the whole point of this exercise is, but how do you determine that? And there are other potential sources of bias that we didn't have the opportunity to test, but they arose in our discussions with OPA. And we think they generally recognize these problems, but it is important to recognize that the problems exist more in minority and low-income neighborhoods than elsewhere in the city. Their property condition grades, which again is always a subjective matter, but the way they are used within the different OPA zones suggests to us that this can be a significant source of problem. The way they use the market areas, and what they do is actually divide each of the OPA zones into much smaller areas within the zones. But then the statistical modeling that they do, they average those smaller areas together, and it leads to biases. If you know multiple regression, you'll understand the problem that regression tends to move things towards the average. Any statistical modeling process actually builds on averages, but if you have one area where the value per square foot is higher and another area where the value per square foot is lower, you average them together, you're going to get the lower price properties overassessed, the higher priced ones underassessed. There's always a question of the accuracy of the original data and the use of stepwise regression, which I'm not going to try and talk about here now, but this is an example of where a supposedly or factually objective statistical process nevertheless leads potentially to biased results because of underlying characteristics in the data that the model is not able to adjust for. So ironically, what we are suggesting is not necessarily more objective scientific knowledge and practices, but rather better subjective use, better use of the subjective judgments that inevitably come into play in any scientific process. We move on here.
Yeah, we're running a little tight on time. We're pretty good, but let's move forward.
Yeah. So in the last few years, OPA has significantly improved the citywide accuracy of its assessments for small residential properties, as measured by the median ratio, the COD, and the PRD. However, there remain neighborhood hotspots where these three measures of assessment quality are not within the standards set by IAAO. And specifically, if you live in a neighborhood with a higher percentage of Black, Hispanic, or low-income residents, differences among neighbors in assessments are not within IAAO standards for the COD, and they are greater compared to neighborhoods with a majority of white or higher income residents. And continuing, if you own a home in a higher priced home in these neighborhoods where there are problems, you are more likely to be underassessed. If you own a lower priced home, you're more likely to be overassessed. This means that the owner of a lower priced home in a predominantly Black and low income neighborhood will pay more than their fair share when compared to their neighbor down the street with a higher value home. And now, Monty, where would you like us to go from here?
All right. So, I think our findings and conclusions are the least interesting thing about the report. As you can see, once Art and Ira walk you through the charts, the data is there's a huge question here about which data you use, what you include, what you exclude from the data file, how you determine what's valid and what isn't a valid sale. So with that all in mind, we came up with a series of recommendations. What we did with the second report was hand it to Sherelle Parker, the new mayor of Philadelphia, and frankly ask her, get out in front of this. We don't want to have a battle about this. We think this is a national problem and Philadelphia should be a national leader. And to her credit, Sherelle Parker has announced that there's going to be a task force chaired by Ira, looking into best practices to deal with how to deal with racial bias and ethnic bias in property tax assessments. Our recommendations around that begin to get at some of the questions that came up just now. I don't think it will surprise anyone that we believe that this kind of a third-party independent ratio study with demographics, as I said earlier, needs to be an annual event, and it needs to be independently funded, separate from the OPA. Someone like the reinvestment fund or some other policy group in your local county needs to do this every year to test to see whether there is evidence of some kind of systemic bias. That needs to be independent from the OPA itself. The OPA does a ratio study every year. However, they do it at a citywide level. They're not hiding anything, but if you don't drill down further, you don't find the disparities. You also don't have a separate group looking at the data files themselves and saying, well, why did you leave that out? Why did you include abated properties? Why did you exclude all properties that were interfamily transfers? No one was asking those questions. So you need a third party to go there. Secondly, just like any entity that is dealing with systemic bias, just like a lender who's maybe accused of some bias in lending, you need to have in-house processes to try to detect for that before you release the new assessments. One of the biggest points that the OPA made to us in our initial discussions was we can't take race into account in doing residential assessments. And that's correct. They have a computerized system that can consider over, I think it's 1,500 different factors in an assessment. If one of those factors was the race of the owner, that would be intentional discrimination. But once they do this kind of neutral assessment, once they have the information from reports like ours, they need to have in-house processes to kind of review those processes on the back end to say, well, is there any evidence if we drill down into the neighborhoods that there is some systemic bias here? And I think especially once they have a report like this, there needs to be an in-house system that will allow them to say, we need to take a double look at the valuations we made in these particular neighborhoods because we already know we have problems. That in-house system should deal with a lot of this bias. We believe that a lot of this information needs to be public and transparent, not just the data, which the OPA actually does believe, but the data around how they make decisions about what to include and exclude, how they make the data about how particular condition codes are set in. All that needs to be publicly available. If you jump to the next slide. Same thing with the condition grades and the results for individual properties. So one of the things we're going to get to that we haven't talked about today is how property assessment appeals affect this process. And in Philadelphia, there is some general information available online about people's assessments. You can find out what your valuation is. You can see what it has been historically. You can see what the condition code is. That's that classification that will say that your property compared to others in the neighborhoods is above average, below average, or average. What there isn't is any of the underlying information. I don't know what it means that my property is average. Why is it above average compared to other properties? I don't know what my square footage is based on the OPA records compared to the person next door to me. All that data needs to be public so that people can see the factors that affected their final valuation. We believe that properties with abatements should be flat out excluded. That's legally required, but that also, I think Art would say, that falsely inflates the values of properties in areas where there are abatements. Is that right, Art?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, along with transparency, there needs to be kind of public oversight. It doesn't need to be kind of a daily, oversight of the daily practices of the OPA. But as we go forward, looking for this evidence of systemic bias and ways to remedy it, as they're putting their in-house procedures in place, as they're doing these annual reports, and as they're coming out with each new year's assessments, there needs to be a stakeholder group of the OPA, city administration, city council, and legal service attorneys and homeowners to maybe meet with them quarterly to go over what the steps are being taken and whether they're working, and see how it's going in the future. For instance, in June, Philadelphia is coming out with their 2025 assessments for the first time in 2 years. And we are going to be very interested in how much those increases are. We expect to find out any day. Once those numbers come out, my question to the OPA is going to be, what's the basis for this? What's the data underneath it? And finally, the sister issue to all of this is looking at the appeals system. In Philadelphia, we have the Board of Revision of Taxes that hears assessment appeals, and the assessments, depending on who appeals, how much the valuations are, and who is successful and who is not successful, and where they're successful, is going to have an enormous impact on these assessments. We don't, just like 3 years ago, I couldn't tell you, except anecdotally, that there were hotspot neighborhoods in Philadelphia where the assessments were inaccurate. I can't tell you today what neighborhoods in Philadelphia file the most appeals. I can't tell you what the size of those valuations are. I can't tell you what neighborhoods have the most success on their appeals, and I can't tell you the race of those participants. I think that's another question that we need to get into. So with those recommendations in mind, we presented them to the mayor, and what she's done is move forward and call for a task force to come up with a set of best practices and kind of recommendations that aren't just ours, but pulling in experts from the IAAO, other academic experts across the country who are looking at this, to come up with what I think will be a national model for best practices to look at racial bias in assessments. And with that in mind, Brittany, can we take the mics off? Is there a way we can allow people to just ask their questions? And Art's going to take over and we'll all answer the questions.
Right. Any questions, commentary, observations that anyone wants to make? And if you can't speak directly,
and I've got the chat open.
You got the chat. You want to handle the chat. Anybody want to pull questions out of the chat?
Well, I'm going to give people to think for a second. I'm going to ask you the question that always comes up for me, for both you and Ira. It's pretty clear that data is the key here, right? I think what the second report did was move past the kind of argument about we had the wrong data to, all right, we're going to use both sets of data. But as you can see, it makes an enormous difference which data set you use. They're both inaccurate, but the OPA tends to say that people are underassessed or under the coefficient of dispersion, whereas the reinvestment fund data seems to say more likely that properties are overassessed. How do you account for those differences between the two data sets?
There are a lot of factors that come into making that decision. One, we can just start with the fact that most people, most professionals working at OPA are full-time professionals with quite a bit of training, and they live in neighborhoods with appropriately priced houses for their background and salaries and training. And without even recognizing it, we all take our surroundings as normative. And I have personally talked with sales reviewers, evaluators in assessors' offices who have said, you know, Art, we reject that sale because we just don't believe anything could sell for that small an amount of money. And they honestly believe that because that's their honest experience. We all have a personal responsibility to move out of our own experience and recognize that conditions can be different in different places. That's one bias, and it's one reason why I said earlier, we're not looking at strictly, the answer here is not the conventional American, more science, more quote objectivity. It's actually returning to our subjectivity and recognizing the importance of using that correctly and responsibly.
Ira, you want to add anything?
Yeah, one of the things that that came up in our almost year plus set of discussions with the folks from the Office of Property Assessment revolved around this notion of rejected sales, and that's sort of what we've been talking about now. And you know, as you all are sort of in the business of looking at discrimination from various sectors, be it employment or housing, and you have familiarity with this concept of disparate impact discrimination. One of the things in the proof theory around disparate impact and sort of bringing forward a case is essentially to start to try and get a sense as to what if it's not blatant discrimination where you're saying X doesn't like this group of people or that kind of applicants, et cetera, what you're really looking at is neutral policies that perhaps operate differentially or disparately to create the result that you have. We tried to figure out what that difference was, and we did come up with that notion of the rejected sales. And then we were able to see that the concept of rejecting sales wasn't just a random event, but occurred more frequently in certain kinds of neighborhoods. When we presented that to OPA, they came back to us and they said, you know, we actually think you're sort of right about that. It's a problem that we uncovered ourselves. And in the past, we might have had, I forget how many, they said 15, 20 individuals making decisions about which sales to take or not take for purposes of creating the assessments, or then sort of going back and looking at the quality of what they did through a ratio study. But what they did is they more centralized that so that they could be more consistent in the way those decisions are made. I actually think that that consistency that they were able to achieve between the first study and the second study actually is part of the way that they got to a set of results that were actually a little bit better between the first and the second study, you know, in favor of that second study, but still not quite right. But that change between study one and study two, that one of the things associated with it being sort of centralizing that decision making around what gets rejected and what doesn't, I think that that's one of the ways that they were able to achieve a better result, and one that that shows less problems than the first time around.
We have a note here from Brittany that everyone should be now able to unmute yourself. And so if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or again, make a comment.
I had a question about the task force that Cheryl Parker and you're starting, and I believe it's Ira, are you going to be the chair? Was that correct?
That's the plan, yes.
Oh, well, I was wondering, who are the key members? Otherwise, how would people be appointed to that, or would that be on a volunteer? Has it gotten to that stage thus far?
Yeah, we're very close, Caroline, and thank you for that question. We're very close. We've identified a handful of people that we think are sort of naturals for being on this, and they include some of the folks that you would expect, that being, you know, folks from the administration who are involved in this, folks who've been involved in this study, and a few others. We've also identified some outside of Philadelphia folks who've been looking at this issue, from people from the National Consumer Law Center, you know, a variety of different places. The idea would be that we will present the mayor and her team with a group of candidates that we think have value to add to this endeavor. And then she'll or we'll jointly make a decision as to who will be on, and then hopefully we'll get rolling. We are literally in the 23rd hour, or whatever the metaphor is, in terms of budget making in Philadelphia, and I think that has consumed the administration and city council's attention over the last couple of weeks. That will be done, I think, about a week from today, at which point we hope to get, you know, up and running with this. So,
for those who are interested in the history here, you know, this obviously is very technical. We wanted to set up quantitative measures of assessment quality. One of the people that we're looking at to be on the task force is a historian from the University of Virginia, Andrew Carl. He just came out with a book, 150 years of dealing with 150 years of property tax racial bias in America, looking at about 18 different locations in the city and looking at the last 150 years, how assessments and property taxes specifically have been used to disadvantage minorities. It's not as technical as what we did here today, but it is an absolutely fascinating history. So anybody that wants to dig into the history of this, I would absolutely recommend that you grab The Black Tax by Andrew Carl and start reading. It even features art in one chapter in particular dealing with Chicago, but it is a fantastic history of this stuff.
and for those who are willing to bear with me on a slight off-color remark, I thought Monty was going to go in a slightly different direction with this, which is Mayor Parker, when she was a city council member, looked at a companion issue to this, which was appraisal bias, racial bias in home appraising. And they're different issues. The appraisals operate differently and are arrived at differently than mass assessing, which is what we're talking about today. But in some ways, have some of the same issues. She held a public hearing. She was a council member at that time, and myself, I testified, a group of other people testified about that issue. And at some point, somebody did, although the focus of the public hearing was on appraisals, somebody brought up assessing. And then council member, now Mayor Parker, said, well, wait a second. Am I hearing this right? You know, if I live in a black neighborhood in Philadelphia, I get screwed one way, and then with my appraisals, and I get screwed the other way with my assessment. And that's pretty much the direct quote. Monty remembers that. I found the link for the YouTube chat. And that's right. It's hard to reconcile that they go in opposite directions, but they do. And her attention to the appraisal issue a couple of years ago led us to believe that she was going to be naturally interested in taking on this assessment issue, because, as she said in a number of different forums over the last couple of years, economic justice is racial justice, and both of these things do in fact operate differently in a way that create economic disparities and racial disparities.
You know, underlying this, just under the surface, is this question of gentrification, where, you know, markets just shift enormously in very short spans of time for people who have done nothing and literally have very little control over their real estate prices. There's a Pennsylvania law that is supposed to allow some relief for that, but it's based on post renovation price increases caused by renovation, but often the price increases are created more by the what I'll call the real estate industry developing a marketing campaign. What a wonderfully chic neighborhood, undiscovered this area is. And they begin to market that. Its quaint charms, precisely its older homes, which are supposed to be of low value theoretically, but precisely that gives it its value and its chic and its character. And so you potential buyers with lots of money ought to come over here because this is the newest undiscovered neighborhood. And they begin to bid prices up. Assessments then go up and ought to go up for the properties that have sold when they purchased that property, even before renovating it, for some unimaginably high price to the neighbors. That's the value that they have just placed on the property. That's what its assessment ought to be. But we need to find ways to limit the assessment increases for neighbors who have created the chicness by just simply by their existence there for all those years.
And just as a brief update, on that front, there is state enabling legislation allowing municipalities to enact an assessment freeze. It went into effect about 2 years ago. Philadelphia there's a bill pending right now in City Council to enact that assessment freeze. And it looks like we will know whether that's going to become law, if not by the end of today, by the end of this week. And what that would do is allow qualified low-income families. For an individual, it'd be someone whose income is at about $31,500 a year or below, or a family of two with an income about $44,000 a year, to qualify for an assessment freeze at the year of the freeze. So that would be this year's assessment. And that would mitigate the effects of increasing gentrification.
Just to clarify, it's actually a tax freeze. Your assessment can go up, but your taxes cannot go up. And that's it's an important distinction. And that looks like it likely will go through.
I don't know if other counties have. They have the authority. So Brittany asked the question if other areas have enacted the freeze. I don't know of any others that have, but there is statewide authority. Okay, well then if there are no other questions, Carolyn, I don't know if you wanted to say a few final words.
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Ira, Monty, and R. The vivid description of your discoveries is inaccurate and ununiform and regressive resonates. In a way, the data presented, it was alarming and regrettable, but still like not surprising in so many ways. I'm sure everyone on this call could relate to that in our line of work. I wanted to also make note of, Ira, that we are here at PHRC working on a gentrification guide with LaSalle University and Professor Charles Gallagher there. And when we have that, we're expecting a draft of that this summer, and probably releasing it by early fall, and we would be, happy to share that with you. So that's something, gentrification is something that's on the forefront almost every meeting that we meet in housing concern in so many rural and small and not rural, many of our areas and many times when we're meeting, that is something that is just very unfair and very concerning to residents and citizens. So once again, thank you for your time, your expertise, your dedication to the critical topic. We're going to be continuing this discussion with our commissioners as you come to our July public hearing. Public meeting. We're very excited that the commissioners and our senior management will be hearing in the public session this presentation, and that will be on July 22nd. Thank you also for the resources. We will definitely be purchasing and looking at that book by Andrew Carl. I got the spelling of his last name incorrect, so I'm glad that you corrected that there in the chat. Thank you. I did want to ask one other question just about the task force again. So where you are with the putting that together. Eventually, though, residents and community members will have a chance. Do you foresee that as them having a chance to be able to get involved at some point as well?
Yeah, Caroline, the plan is at this point for there to be an opportunity or two for public hearings. I don't know if we call it hearings, it might raise it to a different level, but certainly a public listening sessions a couple times during the period of time that the task force is working. So absolutely.
Oh, understood. You're in the inaugural stages of putting it together right now. So yes, it's been very interesting. I know that the format was technical. The material was, but having the graphics just really made that stark what we already know, but it was still astounding to see with the graphics and maps. I cannot thank you enough for presenting here with us today for our staff, and we're looking really forward to see you all again at the public hearing. If no one has any further questions, we will be making this available through recording, so we can definitely. I understand that it is technical and definitely deserves another listen. And thank you for allowing us to have that resource. I think that's going to be so valuable for us.
And I might make just one final observation here about the importance of regular and frequent reassessing. I know in Pennsylvania, there is no state law, there is no requirement for frequent reassessing. But these problems get worse because market values change at different rates in different parts of the city. That's true whatever city, whatever county you're in. And if you don't stay on top of the changes with frequent reassessments, you get these biases in the system. The lower valued properties continue with their relatively higher assessments, and the higher valued properties, as markets change, don't get their assessments increased slowly as markets change, typically slowly. But all of a sudden, after 15 years, there's a reassessment, and now you've got 15 years of changes to make up for, and it creates chaos in people's minds and dramatic changes in property taxes that all could be avoided with more frequent reassessments. It's a budget question, but that question is worth discussing.
Definitely. And again, I believe that your statement that this study will likely become a national model is very accurate. And again, we're so lucky to have the three of you here with us today to present this to us And thank you so much for your time and your
Thank you.
expertise.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure.
And maybe one other item is to, we've done this several times already, but to give credit to people at OPA for really taking this seriously and demonstrating to assessment offices throughout the state of Pennsylvania and even in the rest of the country. And there's a few other assessors in other parts of the country who are seriously trying to work with these questions and getting them in the forefront of pushing this through the IAAO and other assessors.
All right, I think we're done.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.